Hi, I'm Sarah Cowgill, along with Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, Graham Noble, and John Clark. And this is The Conservative Five, an online TV production of Liberty Nation News. It didn't take long for President Trump to reach out to Vladimir Putin to establish the ground rules for a negotiated end to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The commander-in-chief, being true to his word, would not waste time watching the carnage continue on both sides. The casualties and destruction in Ukraine are increasing. Despite the heroic stand against Russian aggression, there's little evidence that Kiev's forces are gaining ground, and I don't think they have a shot. Dave, although Ukraine's President Zelensky insisted to the Biden administration that he would resist trading land for peace, that position has become more difficult to maintain and a lot more attractive to ending this.
Well, you're right. And I think that this idea of Ukraine attempting to, scrabble back all of its land that it's lost. Well, that train left the station a long time ago in April 2014, when President Obama did absolutely nothing when Russia occupied the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the eastern part of Ukraine and then annexed Crimea, and absolutely nothing was done, and the die was cast. There was no going back from that, despite what President Zelensky would like to believe is possible. The unpleasant reality is exactly what Secretary Hegseth has explained. The land has been traded. It's too late. It's unrealistic to try to go back and recapture all of that. And what the Trump negotiating team did in the Riyadh is to build confidence between the two nuclear powers that don't trust each other and that have to have some level of trust between them in order to go forward. And the U.S. meeting with the Russians to set the negotiating stage, so to speak, was the right thing to do. To have included the Europeans would have been of no value added. Can you imagine the Europeans coming to with all individual equities and wants and desires? It would have been ridiculous. And I think that Rubio was exactly right to remind people that the Europeans had 3 years to deal with the Russians and failed. And President Trump is the only one with the presence to be successful in bringing peace to Ukraine, I believe.
Okay, and here's what I'm wondering. I'm not the most internationally astute war girl, but John Clark, Trump has leverage with Ukraine, but not so much with Putin. Is Zelensky just going to have to concede?
Well, I think that, looking at the international perspective and some professors and academics with much more knowledge than I have suggested that this whole thing has been sort of a brinksmanship between European and perhaps Obama-Biden interest to push Russia into the corner, a sort of Bay of Pigs situation. And notwithstanding the propaganda that Ukraine is this valiant opponent of totalitarian domination, Russia was backed in a corner, didn't have much choice, some would say. If that's true, and I think there is truth to that, perhaps, then Putin has to save face with his own people after having lost a lot more than treasure, some hundreds of thousands of people. And so, and really, Ukraine looks sort of like the land between the trenches in World War I, completely destroyed. It doesn't have money left. And you mentioned land. It's already ceded its lands. USAID has been a conduit for large multinational corporations and oligarchs to buy up more than half of its farmland in the last few years since this war started, traded off for loans so that to fund the war. They've already lost it. In fact, if Putin were to take some of this land as part of a settlement, I wonder how much of it is owned by, Bayer or some U.S. companies assisted with the USAID, as was done in Iraq. And so I just think the reality is that if again, as Dave said, that time was when Biden had at least two opportunities to settle this war and said, no, we must go on. Now we see J.D. Vance posturing in Germany against European interests that wanted to make this some big win for NATO.
They crashed the party there.
They need to redraw the lines that were agreed after World War II that the NATO alliance violated, it seems to me. And so there has to be some concession, if only for Putin to save face, but also he is holding a lot of the chips. There's been another assault now, and I'm not sure that we want a third world war over Ukraine. And it's tragic, but I'm not sure how much Zelensky's ever been a legitimate leader. And he's already signed off on a lot of this giveaway of the country's assets. It's bankrupt. It's destroyed. It has no forces left to fight. So they're talking about calling up the British. I don't think that's going to go too well. We can ask our British correspondents. And so I think Putin's in a strong position to make demands. And certainly if the U.S., as indicated by Vance and Trump, is now making its ongoing funding of this war conditional, I don't think really the Ukrainians, sadly, have much to say about it. And I don't say that with lack of compassion. I think they've been destroyed by a war of proxies that the U.S. maybe has been complicit in and maybe now has to help clean up.
Well, Andrew, and, Claire brought up numbers. You know how much I love those. But what is the tally of the war so far for the U.S.?
If you may just once again for the second straight segment, piggyback on what John was saying, I would say you're absolutely right. Trump has nothing over Russia right now. Russia is making more revenue from this war based on energy. It's even selling oil indirectly to the United States by shipping it to India. Then India ships it to the United States. So there's really no benefit from it. But yes, this is an interesting question. But numbers do vary. You probably need Doge in the future to uncover the true cost of this war. But President Trump says the war has cost $350 billion. Zelensky says the number is closer to $320 billion, with the U.S. and Europe covering 2/3 of this tally. The Council on Foreign Relations, just before we went on air, published a report saying that the United States assistance to Ukraine has been about $470 billion, with the United States covering 1/3 of that cost. So there's not really an official number of everything. But I think there's another interesting number of this. It's $300 billion. This is $300 billion that was of Russian assets that were frozen by the United States and Europe. Now, this is consequential because the United States is not at direct war with Russia, and yet it confiscated and appropriated those funds to Ukraine to help with both the war effort and the post-reconstruction efforts going on there. So I think, but overall, no matter what the figure is, it's for many Americans, according to the polls, it's just too much. It's particularly when you're running a $2 trillion deficit, a $36 trillion national debt, $200 trillion of unfunded obligations and liabilities, and perhaps a default on a debt in the next couple of months. So many people would not be able to find Ukraine on a map, and yet they're forced to subsidize this war that they have nothing to do with, that doesn't impact the United States. So I'm sure Dave will disagree with that conclusion. But overall, nobody knows the official number. All we know that it's huge.
Huge. Okay, well, since we've all decided that it's probably not the greatest thing, that it probably has to come to an end, Graham, what is it gonna take to get the peace process complete? I mean, what's next?
Well, that's always messy, and eventually, like the first step is going to have to be, a ceasefire. That doesn't mean that the war's over. It doesn't mean there's a truce, but it just means that they just stop shooting at each other for a while. And the ceasefire comes about by, each side getting a little of what they want. There'll be a prisoner of war exchange is always a big factor in that. And then maybe within Ukraine itself, there will be some population shifts, literally, where you get, ethnic Russians who are living in parts of Ukraine that are still controlled by Ukraine, moving to like the Luhansk or the Donetsk region or whatever. You get ethnic Ukrainians. I don't think there is a great deal of ethnic difference between Russians and Ukrainians, actually. But if you want to call it ethnic Ukrainians, maybe some of them get transported into areas that are under Ukrainian control, if they're now in Russian-controlled areas. So you get those swaps of prisoners of war. You get those swaps of maybe little segments of population. And you get maybe a concession here or two on the part of each side, and then you have a ceasefire. And then once you've got that ceasefire, what will happen is that international organizations will move in. Organizations like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I worked for in Bosnia after the Balkan Wars, and they will go in and they do things like kind of political stabilization. They organize elections and all kinds of stuff, and they do a certain amount of reconstruction. So you have that, and then once you got the international aid organizations on the ground, it then becomes much harder for the two sides to start fighting each other. I mean, there'll be breaches of the ceasefires, and each side will point the finger at the other. But if you've got a couple of thousand foreign aid workers and reconstruction workers on the ground, that kind of almost effectively, grinds the war to a halt. But ultimately, for a lasting peace, the Russians are going to have to concede that they are never going to just get to swallow up the whole of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are going to have to concede that, yes, they're never getting some territory back. They're never getting the Crimea back. They're not getting Luhansk and Donetsk back because the Russians are just not going to pack up and walk out. So, it's not going to be the same Ukraine that it was. And only when both sides finally decide that, okay, our ultimate goals are not achieved, but the big goal for the Russians, and I don't have a personal side here. I think all of them are awful. All of them, the whole lot. In Moscow and Kiev, I don't like any of them, and I don't trust any of them. But the Russians will have gotten one victory out of this, and that is that Ukraine will not become a part of NATO.
Well, there you go. Okay, guys, I'm going to close with a quote from American icon Will Rogers, who astutely said, "I have a scheme for stopping war. It's this. No nation is allowed to enter a war till they have paid for the last one." Thanks, panel. Thanks for tuning in. We'll keep you posted out there. That's it for our Conservative 5 panel today. Check out our other C5 shows and segments on your favorite video platform, YouTube, Vimeo, Rumble. We're on them all. As well, Liberty Nation News has its own Roku channel, where you can see all of our TV productions. Now, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. I'm your host, Sarah Cowgill. Thanks for joining us today for the latest news and commentary. Your choice for free thinking, free speech, libertynation.com.